Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Glad to have you here for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, have you ever looked twice at a signature, wondering if the hand that made it told the whole truth? Watson learned that paper can lie, but habit rarely does. Do subscribe so no forgery escapes your notice. Find us too on Spotify, link below. Now, look closer. For as Holmes believed, it is the small, unconsidered trifle that never fails to betray. Chapter 1. A Most Respectable Morning. It has been my habit, in setting down these records of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, to begin where the singularity of a case first announced itself, whether in a telegram torn open at breakfast, or a visitor's boot heel upon our stair. In the matter I'm about to relate, the singularity lay not in any dramatic eruption, but in the wholly ordinary and even tedious manner of its beginning, for there are crimes, as Holmes was fond of observing, which come to us disguised as nothing more than paperwork. It was a grey forenoon in the November of that year, the fog lying thick along the embankment, when Holmes and I found ourselves not in Baker Street, but in the hushed and polished chambers of Messrs. Arkwright and Fane, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn. I had accompanied my friend at his own request, for he had remarked over breakfast that a case involving nothing more sinister than a duplicated legal filing might nonetheless repay careful study, and that in his experience the driest soil sometimes concealed the deepest roots. The offices themselves spoke eloquently of respectability. Every brass plate without was buffed to a soldierly shine, and within the clerks moved with the disciplined quiet of men who had never in their lives raised their voices above the requirements of civility. It was into this atmosphere of ordered calm that Mr. Septimus Arkwright received us, a spare, grey gentleman of perhaps 60 years, whose hands, I noticed, trembled very slightly as he arranged the papers upon his desk, though his voice remained level. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I confess I hesitated long before writing to you. Ours is not a profession given to sensation, and the matter I bring you is, on its face, a dry one. And yet I cannot rid myself of the conviction that something is gravely wrong." Holmes settled into the chair opposite, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and regarded the solicitor with that quality of attention which I had so often seen disarm the reticence of nervous clients. "Pray let the matter appear as dry as it will, Mr. Arkwright. I have found that the driest matters are frequently the most instructive. Tell me of your client." "The late Sir Edmund Vale," said Arkwright, "a gentleman of considerable fortune, who died some 3 weeks since at his house in Kensington. He was, I may say frankly, not universally beloved. His charities were generous and much reported. His private dealings, I have reason to believe, were a good deal colder. He was a widower these many years, and his household consisted of his niece, Miss Clara Vale, who had kept his house since girlhood, his physician, Dr. Basil Merriweather, who had attended him through a long final illness, his former secretary, Mr. Hugh Lanchester, dismissed some years back under circumstances I have never fully understood, his housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, and the family's curate, the Reverend Ambrose Keene, who was a frequent and welcome visitor. "A respectable circle," Holmes murmured. "Entirely so, Mr. Holmes. That is precisely what troubles me. Each of these persons enjoys a spotless reputation. A physician's word is not lightly questioned, nor a clergyman's, nor, I should hope, a solicitor's. And yet—" He paused, and drew from a drawer 2 folded documents, laying them upon the desk between us with the care of a man handling something that might yet explode. "And yet I hold before you 2 probate filings, Mr. Holmes, both purporting to be genuine, both entered through the proper channels of the registry, and both bearing Sir Edmund's name. They cannot both be true. They support 2 entirely different wills." Holmes leaned forward and drew the papers toward him, his eyes moving swiftly across the close legal script. I confess that to my own eye the 2 documents appeared identical in their formality, differing only in the names of certain beneficiaries and the sums apportioned to each. The earlier will, Arkwright continued, drawn some 4 years ago, leaves the bulk of the estate to Miss Clara Vale, with modest provisions for the household staff. The later, dated but 11 months past, reduces Miss Vale's portion considerably, and enriches Mr. Lanchester, the very secretary Sir Edmund is understood to have dismissed in some anger. A curious generosity toward a discharged servant, said Holmes. Curious indeed. Yet what alarms me more than the discrepancy itself is the response it has provoked. I have questioned each member of the household gently, as my position permits, and every one of them, Mr. Holmes, every single one, insists with perfect composure that the matter must be some clerical error at the registry. No indignation, no surprise, only a smooth and unanimous assurance that all will be found in order upon inquiry. Holmes set down the papers and regarded the solicitor with a faint light kindling in his grey eyes, a light I had learned to recognise as the herald of genuine interest. Mr. Arkwright, you have brought me a puzzle far more valuable than 2 pieces of paper. You have brought me a household in which no one appears to lie, and yet in which the truth cannot possibly be single. When 6 respectable persons agree too readily upon an explanation that explains nothing, I begin to suspect not carelessness, but design. Then you will take the case? I will take it gladly. Watson, we must not neglect the registry itself, for a duplicate filing does not create itself. It must be carried by some hand through some door. But I think our first duty is to Vale House, and to the members of this admirably composed family. I have a fancy, Mr. Arkwright, that respectability, examined closely enough, has a grain to it, like wood, and that even the finest veneer will show where the saw has bitten crooked. Arkwright rose, visibly relieved to have surrendered his burden into more capable hands, and promised to furnish us with a letter of introduction to Miss Vale before the day was out. As we descended once more into the fog of Lincoln's Inn, I ventured to ask my friend what he made of the affair thus far. Only this, Watson, said he, drawing his coat about him against the chill, that a forger who wishes to profit by his forgery conceals it, a forger who wishes to profit by confusion displays it, and waits to see who moves first to explain it away. We are not yet hunting a thief, my friend. We are hunting a stage manager. I did not then understand the full weight of his words, though I was to remember them very often before this singular case had run its course. Chapter 2. The House Where No One Lied. Vale House stood upon a quiet crescent in Kensington, its black-draped windows and closed shutters proclaiming mourning with the same correctness with which its owner had, in life, proclaimed charity. A manservant in unrelieved black admitted us without a word, and I was struck at once by the peculiar hush of the place, a silence not of grief exactly, but of grief carefully arranged, as one arranges flowers for effect. We were shown into a long drawing room hung with dark green paper, where a fire burned low, and where, one by one, over the course of that grey afternoon, we were to meet the household of the late Sir Edmund Vale. Miss Clara Vale received us first. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, dark-haired, composed, dressed in unrelieved black relieved only by a small cameo brooch that had, I thought, belonged to her mother. Her manner was gracious, if reserved, and she spoke of her uncle with what appeared to be genuine, if measured, affection. He was not an easy man, Mr. Holmes, she said, seating herself with her hands folded precisely in her lap. I will not pretend otherwise to you, whatever I may have said to Mr. Arkwright. He was exacting, and he did not forgive readily, but he raised me when he need not have done, and I owe him a debt I cannot now repay, since he is gone, and the accounts, it seems, are in some confusion. You refer to the 2 filings, said Holmes. I refer to them, yes, though I understand very little of the particulars. I am told the matter will resolve itself as a clerical error. She said this last with the smoothness of a lesson well learned, and I saw Holmes's eyes narrow very slightly, though his face betrayed nothing further. Mr. Hugh Lanchester came next, a lean man of perhaps 35, with the slightly apologetic bearing of one long, accustomed to occupying rooms below his proper station. He answered Holmes's questions courteously, almost eagerly, and volunteered, without being asked, that he had been dismissed from Sir Edmund's service some years before. "There was no scandal in it, Mr. Holmes, whatever you may hear," said he. "A disagreement over wages, no more. I bear the old gentleman no grudge that would survive his grave." Yet as he spoke, his fingers moved restlessly along the seam of his coat, and I could not help but recall Holmes's oft-repeated maxim that the hands will frequently confess what the tongue denies. Dr. Basil Merriweather, who joined us shortly after, was a broad, grey-whiskered man whose professional gravity sat upon him like a second suit of clothes. He spoke of Sir Edmund's final illness with the fluent, unhesitating detail of a man well accustomed to the sick room, describing the failing heart, the wandering attention of the patient's last days, the quiet and, he assured us, entirely peaceful end. "I attended him to the last hour," said he, "and I can assure you, Mr. Holmes, that no impropriety touched his final wishes. He was indeed remarkably lucid at intervals, even toward the close. It was a small phrase, offered in passing, and I confess it made no particular impression upon me at the time. I record it here only because Holmes was afterward to recall it with an emphasis I did not then comprehend." The Reverend Ambrose Keene completed our circle of witnesses, a mild, round-faced clergyman whose chief contribution was an earnest plea that Holmes proceed gently. For the sake of souls already burdened enough by loss. He knew little of the legal particulars, he confessed, but much, it seemed, of the household's private sorrows, which he recounted with a freedom that struck me as somewhat immoderate in a man of the cloth. When at length we had taken our leave of each in turn, and stood once more upon the crescent in the thickening dusk, Holmes was silent for a long moment, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, his hat drawn low. "Well, Watson," said he at last, "what did you make of them?" "I found them all perfectly candid," I replied. "Miss Vale spoke with feeling, Lanchester with contrition, the doctor with authority, the clergyman with compassion. If anything, I was struck by how little they disagreed." "Precisely so. And there, my dear fellow, lies the whole singularity of the case. Consider, we have interviewed 4 persons upon a matter touching each one's fortune, reputation, or professional pride, and not one of them has contradicted another upon any material point. In my experience, Watson, truth is rarely so accommodating. Witnesses to the same events customarily disagree upon 100 small particulars, the hour, the weather, the tone of a voice, precisely because each has observed honestly and imperfectly. Here, everyone has observed identically and identically little. You suspect them of collusion? I suspect them of nothing so crude. I suspect rather that this household places an extraordinary and, I think, a cultivated trust in appearances. A doctor's word is accepted because he is a doctor, a clergyman's because he is a clergyman, a solicitor's because his very office smells of sealing wax and order. No one here has troubled to verify anything. They have merely deferred to costume and calling." He paused beneath a gas lamp, and I saw the sudden sharpening of his glance that told me some fact, hitherto loose, had settled into place. There is, however, one thread that does not lie flat with the rest. Did you remark, when we questioned the footman in the hall, his account of the clerk who delivered papers to the probate registry? I confessed I had given it little thought. 3 servants, 3 descriptions, Watson, and no 2 alike. One recalls an Irish lilt to his speech, another a faint flavour of French, a third insists he spoke without any accent at all, in the flattest London manner. Now a man's accent does not commonly wander so widely in a single afternoon's errand. Perhaps their memories simply differ, as memories will. Perhaps. Or perhaps, Watson, we are dealing not with faulty recollection, but with a performance imperfectly rehearsed, adapted a little too hastily to each fresh pair of ears. A man who has practised being 3 different sorts of stranger will not always remember, from one telling to the next, which stranger he was. He turned up his collar against the darkening street. We have, I think, seen a household that trusts appearances absolutely. It remains only to discover which appearance among them was built expressly to deceive. We walked some way in silence after that, the fog closing softly about the gas lamps, and I own that I turned over in my mind, without much profit, the various small courtesies and griefs we had witnessed that afternoon, unable as yet to see in them the seam that Holmes's sharper eye had already detected. Chapter 3. The Filing That Should Not Exist. A note reached Baker Street on the second morning following our visit to Vale House, brought round by a breathless clerk before I had so much as finished my coffee. It was from Arkwright, written in a hand considerably less steady than his usual careful script, and it summoned us to Lincoln's Inn upon a matter of the gravest urgency, touching the honour of the dead. We found the old solicitor pacing behind his desk, a document held at arm's length as though it might scorch his fingers. "Mr. Holmes, I have found something I scarcely credit," said he as we entered. "You will recall the duplicate filing supports a later will, dated 11 months before Sir Edmund's death. I had occasion yesterday to examine the supporting papers more closely, for the registry required certain affidavits to be lodged alongside any contested will. And here, Mr. Holmes, here is an affidavit purporting to bear Sir Edmund's own signature, attesting to his soundness of mind at the making of that will." "That is customary enough, surely," I ventured. "It would be, Dr. Watson, were it not dated 2 days after Sir Edmund's death." A silence fell upon the little room. Holmes took the paper from Arkwright's trembling hand and held it to the window light, turning it this way and that with the absorbed care of a jeweller examining a stone of doubtful provenance. "A remarkable oversight," said he at length, "for a man clever enough to forge a signature so competently. One does not forget the date of a death one has arranged to profit by." "Unless," said Arkwright miserably, "the forger did not know the death would come when it did. Sir Edmund's illness was protracted, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Merriweather himself told us the end might have come at any time within a fortnight, or extended some weeks further. A document prepared in advance, and lodged too hastily after the event, might easily bear so fatal an error." "That is well reasoned," said Holmes, and I saw genuine approval in his glance. "We are, then, looking for haste, rather than incompetence, a useful distinction." It was scarcely an hour later, as we sat over the affidavit in Baker Street, that Inspector Lestrade himself was announced, stamping the wet from his boots and shaking his head with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes a troublesome case has resolved itself without undue exertion on his part. "I thought you'd want to know, Mr. Holmes, now that Mr. Arkwright has seen fit to bring in Scotland Yard alongside your good self," said he, not without a certain dryness. "We've had a look into this Lanchester fellow, and I don't mind telling you the case builds itself. He stands to gain the whole of the disputed increase under the later will. He was turned off by Sir Edmund some years back, and none too gently either, over a matter of unpaid wages, if you please, and there was talk of an insult offered to his family into the bargain. A man with a grudge and a motive of solid cash, Mr. Holmes. I don't say we haven't stranger cases, but I've hanged men on thinner evidence than that." "You have not hanged this one yet, I think," said Holmes mildly. "No, and I don't propose to act hastily. But I'll tell you plainly, I mean to have him in for questioning within the week, and I'd wager my pension he can't account satisfactorily for his movements on the day that filing was lodged." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking down into the wet street with his hands clasped behind him, a posture I had long since learned to associate with the working of some private and dissenting thought. "Consider the matter as a craftsman would, Lestrade, rather than as a magistrate. Here is a man, by your own account, sufficiently clever to forge a dead man's signature, with skill enough to deceive a probate registry, and to construct, moreover, an entire supporting fiction of a delivering clerk, disguised, it appears, in 3 separate manners for 3 separate witnesses. Such a man plans, such a man conceals. And yet this same careful architect leaves standing in plain view a document dated after his benefactor's death, a document that could not fail, upon the most cursory examination, to point directly and damningly at whoever profits by the false will. Does that strike you as the error of a clever criminal, or as bait laid for a less clever pursuer? Lestrade's ruddy face darkened somewhat. You'll have your little theories, Mr. Holmes, I don't doubt, but motive and opportunity are solid ground, and I prefer to build upon them rather than upon guesswork about what a clever man would or wouldn't do. Not every criminal is as clever as the criminals you're accustomed to chasing. That is very possibly true, said Holmes, with a courtesy that did not entirely conceal his impatience. And I do not ask you to abandon Lanchester as a possibility. I ask only that you keep your net wide a little longer, Lestrade, before you draw it tight about the nearest and most convenient fish. The inspector took his leave shortly after, unpersuaded but not, I think, wholly unimpressed, for he was a fair man within the narrow limits of his method, whatever his want of imagination. When the door had closed upon him, Holmes returned to his chair and sat for some minutes in a silence so profound that I forbore to disturb it. "Watson," said he at last, "a forger who wishes to profit conceals his forgery until the estate is settled beyond recall. A forger who wishes to accuse conceals it just long enough to be found by the right eyes, at the right hour when suspicion has already been directed elsewhere. I begin to think our true quarry has committed no theft at all, in the ordinary sense, but has instead constructed a very elaborate stage, complete with a villain painted broadly enough for Lestrade to recognise at 20 paces. The question that interests me is not whether Lanchester is guilty, for I do not for one moment believe it, but why so much careful artifice has been expended to make him appear so. To protect the true forger plainly, that much is self-evident, but protection is a modest ambition for so much labour, Watson. I have a growing suspicion that this affair reaches towards some purpose larger than the mere redirection of Sir Edmund's fortune from niece to secretary. We have not yet found the shape of the thing entire. We have found only its shadow, cast crookedly across an affidavit dated 2 days too late. He reached for his pipe, and I knew from the deliberate manner of his filling it that the subject, for that evening at least, was closed. Tomorrow, I think, we shall want ink and gloves, and a closer look at certain hands than we have yet troubled to take. Chapter 4. Ink, Accent, and a Pair of Gloves. I came down to breakfast the following morning to find Holmes already at his table by the window, not eating but bent low over the forged affidavit with his lens. A second sheet of Sir Edmund's undisputed correspondence spread beside it for comparison. He had, I noticed, been at this work for some time, for the ash in his pipe was cold, and a second pipe stood half-filled and forgotten at his elbow. Come and look at this, Watson, with your medical eye rather than mine, and tell me what you make of it. I bent over the 2 documents as he indicated. The hand is very similar, I said at length. The same slant, the same formation of the capitals. Similar, yes. Now observe where the pen falters. He traced the letters with the tip of a pencil, never touching the paper itself. Here, upon the word estate, a slight tremor, quickly mastered. Here again, upon the signature itself, the same brief hesitation. But look now at this genuine letter, written by Sir Edmund not 4 months before his death, when his hand was already failing under the illness Dr. Merriweather has described to us. I compared the 2, and even to my untrained eye the difference declared itself. The genuine hand trembles throughout, I said slowly, not merely at difficult passages. Precisely so, and you have put your finger upon the very heart of the matter. An old man's palsy does not consult the dictionary before it shakes, Watson. It trembles upon, and as readily as upon estate. This hand trembles only where a forger, copying unfamiliar letters with unfamiliar care, might reasonably be expected to falter. It is not the tremor of age, it is the tremor of concentration. He set down his lens and rang for Mrs. Hudson, requesting, somewhat to that good lady's evident bewilderment, a fresh pot of coffee and the morning's post together, as though the 2 might arrive by the same conveyance of thought. It was shortly after 10 that we presented ourselves once more at the Probate Registry, where Holmes, with a patience I confess I should not myself have commanded, spent the better part of 2 hours in conversation with the various clerks and porters who had been on duty upon the day the disputed filing was lodged. The results, when at length he shared them with me over a chophouse luncheon, were curious enough. "The gloves interest me particularly," said he, setting down his fork. "One porter recalls that the gentleman who delivered the papers wore gloves of unusually fine quality, quite out of keeping, he thought, with a mild autumn day, and rather more out of keeping still with the rest of his appearance. Which was? There the accounts grow instructive by their disagreement. His coat, all agree, was new or nearly so, a coat such as a moderately prosperous clerk might purchase for a special occasion. But his boots, Watson, his boots were remembered by no fewer than 3 witnesses as decidedly worn, patched even at the toe. Now a man does not commonly renew his coat while neglecting his boots, unless the coat was purchased for the occasion, and the boots were simply the boots he already possessed, and had not thought to change. A costume, then, assembled in haste. A costume assembled by a man of some means who does not habitually go about in patched boots, and who therefore did not think to disguise them, because disguise was not, in his own mind, the game he believed himself to be playing. He dressed the part of a poor clerk's coat, Watson, but he walked in his own boots, as men will, from habit, when their attention is bent wholly upon the face they present rather than the feet that carry them. There was, moreover, a third particular that Holmes had gleaned, and this he related with a certain grim satisfaction. The name Vale itself, Watson, was pronounced by our mysterious clerk in 2 distinct fashions upon the same afternoon, to 2 separate clerks of the registry. To the first he rendered it Vale in the manner I am told of the family's oldest connections and country neighbours. To the second, not half an hour later, he gave it as Val, a pronunciation I am informed is not uncommon among those who have spent long years in the colonies, where English vowels grow flattened by foreign company. 2 accents, then, from a single throat, or one throat attempting, not altogether successfully, to recall which accent it had assumed for which listener. A man trying on an identity, Watson, as one tries on an ill-fitting coat, will sometimes forget between one room and the next which sleeve he has already buttoned. We returned that afternoon to Baker Street to find a note awaiting us from Lestrade, brisk and not a little triumphant in its tone, and Holmes read it aloud with a lifted eyebrow. He informs us that a housemaid at Vale House has come forward with a most affecting tale. It seems Miss Clara Vale was discovered some weeks past in tears over a torn letter bearing Hugh Lanchester's hand, and that certain members of the household have long suspected an attachment between the two, broken off, the maid believes, at Miss Vale's own insistence. Lestrade's theory, as you will readily guess, writes itself. Lanchester, rejected, forges the will to secure by fortune what he could not secure by affection. It has a certain shape to it, I admitted. Jealousy has driven men to stranger crimes. It has the shape, Watson, of a theory constructed to fit a conclusion already reached, which is a very different thing from a theory arising honestly out of evidence. Consider, if Lanchester forged this filing from wounded love, why does it nowhere touch Miss Vale's fortune beyond what the law would in any case allow her? Why construct so elaborate a false clerk, 3 accents and a pair of fine gloves, merely to spite a woman who had already refused him? Real passion, my dear fellow, is a clumsy and an impatient artist. It does not pause to select gloves. It does not rehearse its accent for the benefit of registry porters. This crime has been staged with the cold deliberation of a man building a case for others to discover, brick by convenient brick, and I do not think love laid a single one of those bricks, however conveniently it may serve to explain the whole edifice to a jury. He fell silent then, and drew from his pocket a small notebook in which he had, over the course of the day, set down in his cramped economical hand the various particulars we had gathered, the tremor upon the signature, the new coat and the patched boots, the 2 pronunciations of a single name. I watched him study these fragments for a long while by the firelight, and though he said nothing further that evening, I recognized in his stillness the particular quality of a mind that has begun, however faintly, to perceive the outline of a shape still largely hidden in shadow. Chapter 5. Tears that fell too late. "I find, Watson," said Holmes, as our cab rattled once more toward Kensington, "that a household examined together will present its members as a chorus. I wish this time to hear them singly, and I have written ahead to request that each be seen apart from the rest, beginning with Miss Vale." We found her in a small morning room at the rear of the house, a chamber less formal than the drawing-room in which we had first met her, and hung about with water-colours that I took to be her own work, competent studies of the Kensington gardens in various lights. She received us with the same grave composure as before, though I fancied there was a shadow beneath her eyes that had not been there upon our first visit. "You wish to see me alone, Mr. Holmes," said she. "I confess I do not know what more I can tell you that I have not already told Mr. Arkwright, and now I understand the police as well. I wish only to speak of your uncle, Miss Vale, and of your own grief for him, which I do not for a moment doubt is sincere." "It is entirely sincere," she said, with a sudden warmth that surprised me after her earlier restraint. "Whatever his faults, and I will not pretend he had none, he took me in when my own parents died, and he never once made me feel the burden of that charity, though I know full well it was a burden to a man of his temperament. I have wept for him more than once since his death, Mr. Holmes, and shall weep again, I do not doubt, before the year is out." I confess I found her entirely convincing, and glanced at Holmes to see whether he shared my impression. His face, however, betrayed nothing beyond a polite attention. "You spoke, upon our first visit, of Mr. Lanchester," said he, in a tone so carelessly conversational that I nearly missed its purpose. "Tell me, Miss Vale, was there ever, in earlier years, any particular understanding between yourself and that gentleman?" The change in her was immediate and unmistakable. Her hands, which had lain quiet in her lap throughout our conversation, closed suddenly upon the fabric of her gown, and a faint colour rose and as swiftly faded from her cheek. "I do not see what that can have to do with my uncle's will," said she, and her voice, though still even, had lost something of its former warmth. "Very possibly nothing whatever," said Holmes gently. "I ask only because a servant's tale has reached the police, of a torn letter and of tears, and I would sooner hear the truth from your own lips than a distorted echo of it from Inspector Lestrade's notebook." She was silent a long moment, her gaze fixed upon the watercolours on the wall, as though seeking counsel there. "There was some years ago a friendship between us," she said at last, low. "Nothing improper, Mr. Holmes, whatever the servants may have whispered. It ended because I believed, rightly or wrongly, that my uncle would never countenance it, and I had no wish to bring further discord into a house that had already known enough of it. I have not spoken of this to the police, and I would be glad, sir, if it need not become the subject of common gossip. It is my own history and touches no one's fortune but the fortune of my own heart, long since resigned to its disappointment." "Your fear, then, is not for money," said Holmes, watching her closely, "but for the good name of an old attachment, now become an embarrassment rather than a grief." "You put it more plainly than I should have chosen, Mr. Holmes, but I will not deny it is the truth." We took our leave of her shortly after, and were shown to a small library where Hugh Lanchester awaited us, pacing before an unlit fire with the restless energy of a man who has slept little. "I understand you have spoken to Miss Vale," said he before Holmes had well seated himself. "I will not insult your intelligence by pretending ignorance of what she may have told you. Yes, there was an attachment between us some years since, and yes, it ended unhappily, though by her choosing, not mine, and I bear her no resentment for it, whatever construction Inspector Lestrade may choose to place upon an old and private sorrow." "I didn't come to press you upon that matter," said Holmes. "I am more curious, Mr. Lanchester, as to a certain earlier passage in your history, of which Mr. Arkwright has told me only the barest particulars. I understand that some years before your dismissal you once impersonated a minor clerk in Sir Edmund's own household." Lanchester's pacing ceased abruptly, and for the first time since our acquaintance began, I saw something like genuine fear cross his features, quickly mastered. "That is a very old matter, Mr. Holmes, and one I had hoped need never come to light. I am not concerned with punishing old follies, provided they shed light upon present ones. Tell me the truth of it, and you may find me a more sympathetic listener than you expect." He resumed his seat slowly, and when he spoke again it was in the low, deliberate tone of a man unburdening a confession long carried alone. "My father, Mr. Holmes, was ruined some 15 years ago by an investment gone catastrophically wrong, a scheme in which Sir Edmund himself held an interest, though the precise nature of his involvement was never made clear to us. My father died believing himself cheated, though he could never prove it, and the belief, whether just or not, broke him as surely as the loss of his fortune. When I came into Sir Edmund's service some years later, I confess I nursed a private hope of discovering among his papers some record that might vindicate my father's memory. On one occasion, finding the household records closed to me in my own capacity, I assumed for a single afternoon the character of a junior clerk from another office and gained access to certain old correspondence in that guise. I found nothing conclusive, Mr. Holmes, and I have regretted the deception ever since, not for its risk, but for its futility. "And this," said Holmes slowly, "explains, I think, both your old anger towards Sir Edmund and its curious quality of age rather than freshness. A wound 15 years healed does not commonly drive a man to forge a will within days of a fresh grief. I did not forge it, Mr. Holmes. I swear that before God." "I am inclined to believe you," said Holmes, rising, "though I would be glad of some proof beyond your own asseveration, before I say so to Inspector Lestrade." It remained only to see Dr. Merryweather, and here I observed in Holmes a change of manner I had not expected, a certain deliberate mildness, almost deference, entirely unlike his sharper questioning of the other two. The physician received us into Edmund's own study, and spoke, as before, with a fluent and unhesitating authority upon the whole course of his patient's final illness. He suffered greatly toward the end, Mr. Holmes, though I will say this for the old gentleman, his mind remained his own almost to the last. There is a phrase we physicians use, a lucid interval, for those hours in which a failing patient recovers, briefly, the full clarity of his faculties. Sir Edmund enjoyed several such intervals in his final week, and I have no doubt whatever that his true intentions, whatever the confusion of these wretched papers, were exactly as his earlier and undisputed will describes them. He answered every question thus, fully, promptly, before I had scarcely finished framing it in my own mind, and it was only afterward, as we walked once more toward the cab rank, that Holmes remarked upon it. "You will have noticed, Watson, that of the 3 we have questioned today, Dr. Merryweather alone answered without ever once pausing to consider his reply. Surely that speaks well of his candour. Or," said Holmes quietly, "of long rehearsal. Genuine memory falters here and there, Watson, upon some detail imperfectly retained. A composed account offered with equal fluency upon every point, however small, has very often been prepared in advance for an audience the speaker knew he must eventually face." Chapter 6. The Man Who Was Too Well Remembered. It was Holmes's custom, when a case had begun to trouble him beyond the ordinary, to abandon for a time the persons concerned and pursue, instead, the loose threads of circumstance that lay scattered about them, and so it was that the following 2 days found him engaged upon what he called, with a certain dry humour, the biography of a man who does not exist, namely the mysterious clerk who had carried the false affidavit to the registry. He returned to Baker Street on the second evening in a state of suppressed energy that I had learned to recognise as the surest sign of progress, and flung himself into his chair with his coat still damp from the streets. I have now spoken, Watson, with no fewer than 5 persons who claim to remember our elusive clerk with perfect distinctness, and I confess the experience has been more instructive than I had dared hope. Listen to this catalogue. The first porter recalls that he limped, favouring his left leg. The second recalls a scar above the right eyebrow, quite pronounced, he assures me, and difficult to overlook. A third, a clerk in the record room, remembers his voice as touched with something colonial, Australian, he thought, though he could not be certain. A fourth remembers nothing of voice or leg, but insists most positively upon a missing finger on the left hand. A most singular collection of infirmities for a single man to carry. Singular indeed, Watson, and there precisely is my difficulty. A genuine witness, questioned some weeks after a fleeting encounter, will commonly remember one striking particular clearly and grow vague and uncertain upon the rest. He does not usually retain, with equal and confident precision, 4 or 5 separate distinguishing marks, each vivid, each different from his neighbour's recollection, and none corroborated by any other. I begin to suspect that our clerk was not merely disguised, but disguised with a deliberate and calculated excess, designed less to conceal his true appearance than to plant, in each witness's memory, some single unforgettable feature, a limp here, a scar there, that would forever after make him impossible to mistake for any other man, and equally impossible to identify with any other man, since no two accounts agree. A face constructed to be remembered and forgotten in the same breath. You have put it better than I could myself. A man wishing merely to pass unnoticed dresses plainly and speaks little. A man wishing to be remembered as someone he is not constructs precisely such a gallery of striking, contradictory details as we have gathered here. It is theatre, Watson, and rather accomplished theatre, though its very accomplishment has betrayed it, for no honest recollection is ever so generously supplied with distinguishing marks. It was the following morning that we returned once more to Vale House, this time to seek out Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, whom Holmes had thus far questioned only in passing. We found her in her own small sitting-room below stairs, a stout, capable woman with the settled manner of one who has run a great household for many years and permits herself few surprises. "You have been long in Sir Edmund's service, I understand," said Holmes, seating himself with a courtesy that I observed always won him readier confidences from servants than from their masters. 25 years, sir, man and boy, as one might say of myself, though I'm no boy nor ever was one. I came as an under-housemaid, and I leave, God willing, as housekeeper, and there's not much passes in this house I haven't had occasion to notice, one way or another. Then perhaps you can help me with a small matter of habit rather than event. Dr. Merryweather, in attending Sir Edmund, was he a careful man about the sick-room, particular in his ways? Very particular, sir, as a good physician should be. He'd always the same little ritual, if I may call it that, upon entering the sick-room of a morning. Off would come his gloves, laid just so upon the small table by the door, before ever he'd lay a hand upon his patient. He told me once it was a matter of cleanliness, that a physician's hands must be bare and clean for the sick-room, gloves being a harbour of street dirt, as he put it. And this habit was constant. Constant as the church bells, sir, for the better part of the illness, save once. She paused, frowning slightly, as though the memory had only just presented itself for examination. The day before poor Sir Edmund passed, now that I come to think on it properly, the doctor came in with his gloves still upon his hands, and went straight to the desk where Sir Edmund kept his private papers, and was some while at them before ever he approached the bed at all. I thought nothing of it at the time, sir. A man may forget his own habits when his mind is troubled, and the end was very near by then, as we all knew. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, though I saw his fingers tighten very slightly upon the arm of his chair, a small betrayal of interest that few besides myself would have remarked. "You have been most helpful, Mrs. Pritchard. One further question, if you will permit it. Have you ever, in your 25 years in this house, heard mention of a half-brother to Sir Edmund, a gentleman named Adrian Vale, who went abroad in his youth?" The housekeeper's broad face creased in genuine puzzlement. "I can't say I have, sir, not in my own hearing, though it's true the family was never one to discuss its private history before the servants. There was old talk, now you mention it, among the elder staff when first I came, of some younger brother gone out to the colonies under a cloud, but whether his name was Adrian I couldn't rightly say, and whether he lived or died out there I never heard tell at all. It was Holmes himself, later that same afternoon, poring over a box of old family correspondence which Arkwright had at last consented to release into his keeping, who found the confirmation he sought, a single brittle letter, some 20 years old, addressed to Sir Edmund's late father, and referring in terms deliberately guarded to your younger son Adrian, whose situation in New South Wales continues, I am given to understand, unimproved, and whose return to England, should it ever be contemplated, would raise questions this family has long preferred to leave unraised. There, Watson, said Holmes, laying the letter before me with a satisfaction he made no effort to disguise, is the shadow whose shape I have been seeking these 3 days past. A half-brother, exiled young, believed by the household to be dead, yet spoken of, even 20 years ago, in language that anticipates his possible return and the family's evident wish to prevent it. I do not yet know how this Adrian Vale, living or dead, real or invented, connects himself to our forged affidavit and our theatrical clerk of many faces, but I begin to suspect, my friend, that the true purpose of this duplicate filing was never Hugh Lanchester's fortune at all, but something considerably larger and considerably older than a dispute between a niece and a discharged secretary. Chapter 7. The Convenient Confession. I was wakened on the third morning following our discovery of the old letter by a furious ringing at the bell below, and came down in my dressing gown to find Lestrade already in our sitting room, his hat still upon his head in his evident haste, and an expression of grim triumph that told me, before he had spoken a single word, that some new turn had overtaken the case. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, "I fancy your clever theories will want some revising this morning. We searched Lanchester's lodgings at first light, acting upon information received, and I don't mind telling you we found precisely what we went looking for." Holmes, who had been standing at the window in his own dressing gown, turned with no more than mild interest. "Pray tell us what you found, Lestrade, and equally, if you will, who supplied this convenient information." "An anonymous note delivered to the Yard yesterday evening, directing us to a particular drawer in Lanchester's writing desk. We found there a quantity of paper covered with practice signatures, Sir Edmund's own name, written over and over in a hand plainly striving to imitate the old gentleman's. We found also a false beard, grey, of the sort a theatrical outfitter might supply, and a draft of the very affidavit that has caused Mr. Arkwright so much distress in an early and uncorrected form. I have taken Lanchester into custody, Mr. Holmes, and I think you will agree the case now closes itself very neatly." I confess my own heart sank at this recital, for I had come, over the course of our inquiries, to regard Hugh Lanchester with something approaching sympathy, and the evidence thus baldly stated seemed damning beyond dispute. I glanced at Holmes, expecting some sharp rejoinder, and was startled instead to observe upon his face an expression of almost languid indifference, as though Lestrade had brought him news of a mislaid umbrella rather than an arrest. "You have acted with your customary thoroughness, Lestrade," said he, stifling what I took to be a genuine yawn. "I do not think I shall trouble myself further with the matter this morning. Watson and I had thought of a stroll in the park, the weather being unexpectedly fine." Lestrade's ruddy countenance darkened with something between triumph and irritation. "You'll forgive me, Mr. Holmes, if I say you take this a deal more calmly than I expected, after all your talk of stages and clever architects. It seems to me the architect has been caught with his own blueprints in his own desk drawer." "It does indeed seem so," said Holmes, with a mildness that struck me, even as I heard it, as somehow deliberate, though I could not then have said why. "I wish you every success with your prisoner, Lestrade, and I dare say the matter will resolve itself very much along the lines you propose." The inspector took his leave in a temper compounded equally of satisfaction and suspicion, unable, I think, quite to trust so tame a surrender from a quarter that had opposed him so vigorously not 3 days before. When the door had closed upon him, I turned to Holmes in some perplexity of my own. "I confess I do not understand you," said I. "You have argued from the first that Lanchester was innocent, and now, at the very moment when the strongest evidence yet has been laid against him, you affect to lose interest in the case entirely." "I affect a great deal this morning, Watson, and I shall be glad when the affectation is no longer necessary. Come, let us breakfast, and I will explain myself over the eggs, for I think we have earned a little conversation before we resume our labours in earnest." We drove that same afternoon to Vale House, where we found the household in a state of considerable disturbance. Clara Vale, when we were admitted to her, appeared to have wept a great deal, her composure of earlier visits quite dissolved, and she rose from her chair with an urgency that surprised me in one usually so contained. "Mr. Holmes, you cannot believe this dreadful evidence. I have known Hugh Lanchester these many years, whatever coldness has grown between us since, and I cannot believe him capable of such elaborate deceit." "Miss Vale, I beg you," came a mild but insistent voice from the doorway, and I turned to see the Reverend Keene standing there, his round face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "I understand your loyalty, my dear, but you must not, in charity toward one man, ruin your own good name by defending what the evidence so plainly condemns. It is a hard lesson, but sometimes those we have loved prove unworthy of our faith, and our Christian duty is not to shield the guilty from justice, but to bear the disappointment with fortitude." "You believe him guilty, then, Reverend?" asked Holmes. "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that a man is generally best judged by what is found in his own desk drawer, rather than by what his friends wish to believe of his heart. It grieves me to say so of one I have known, and in my way esteemed. But grief must not blind us to fact." Holmes said little more during our visit, contenting himself with a few desultory questions that seemed, to my eye, to lead nowhere in particular, and we took our leave shortly after in a silence that I forbore for the present to break. It was not until we were once more in our own sitting-room that evening, a fire crackling cheerfully against the November chill, that Holmes at last consented to unfold the reasoning he had so carefully concealed throughout that long, and to me, bewildering day. "You will recall, Watson, our examination of the forged affidavit, and my observation that its hesitations occurred only upon those letters a careful copyist, imitating an old man's failing signature, would find difficult. That was a signature written in an elderly hand, laboriously and skilfully counterfeited. I recall it distinctly. Now consider the practice signatures Lestrade discovered this morning in Lanchester's desk. I examined them myself before we left the yard, upon the pretext of idle curiosity, and I can tell you with confidence that every one of them imitates not the failing, elderly signature that appears upon our forged affidavit, but an earlier, firmer hand, the hand Sir Edmund employed some 15 or 20 years ago, such as might be found upon old family correspondence, but not upon any document of recent date. I confess the significance of this escaped me for a moment. Could he not simply have practised upon whatever specimen came most readily to hand? He might, Watson, were he the true forger. But our true forger, whoever he proves to be, took evident pains to study and reproduce the particular tremor of Sir Edmund's final years. A tremor Mrs. Pritchard herself would confirm to you, appeared only in the last months of his illness. Whoever planted those practice signatures in Lanchester's desk had seen old letters, perhaps the very ones Mr. Arkwright has been so obliging as to place in our hands, but had never troubled to study the actual forged filing that lies at the heart of this case. He built his false evidence from the wrong model, Watson, a sculptor working from an old photograph rather than the living subject. It is a small discrepancy, and I do not doubt it would satisfy a jury unschooled in such particulars, but it satisfies me of one thing beyond dispute. The hand that forged our affidavit and the hand that planted this evening's damning parcel are not the same hand at all, however diligently their common owner would have us believe otherwise. Chapter 8. A Face Prepared for the World. Holmes was gone from Baker Street before I had risen the following morning, and it was not until well past noon that he returned, his boots dusty, and his manner charged with that particular restrained energy which told me more surely than any words that his morning's excursion had borne fruit. "I have been to Drury Lane, Watson, among the theatrical outfitters, a district I confess I have not visited upon business since the affair of the actress and the Duke's letters some years back, a most instructive quarter of London, where a man may purchase for a modest fee and no questions asked the outward appearance of almost any character he cares to assume. You found the shop that supplied our mysterious clerk. I found, after some persistence and the judicious application of £half-a-crown, a costumer named Bilks, who deals chiefly in the requirements of amateur theatricals and the occasional gentleman wishing to attend a masquerade incognito. He recalled, upon my description, a customer of some 6 weeks past, a well-spoken gentleman who purchased spirit gum, a quantity of grey crape hair suitable for a beard or side whiskers, and a small pot of theatrical colouring designed, Bilks assured me, to simulate the weathering of a complexion long exposed to a hotter sun than ours. The customer explained his purchase, when Bilks ventured a polite inquiry, as necessary preparation for a private theatrical entertainment, the character of an elderly relative lately returned from the colonies. Merryweather, I said, the name escaping me before I had well considered it. I did not press Bilks for a description beyond what he volunteered, Watson, for I had rather form my own conclusions from independent evidence than lean upon the uncertain memory of a shopkeeper concerning a customer he sees perhaps 100 times in a season. But the purchase itself is suggestive, is it not, of a face prepared not for the stage, but for a rather more consequential performance. It was that same afternoon, upon Holmes's instruction, that I undertook a small commission of my own, being dispatched to the offices of a shipping agent of Holmes's acquaintance to inquire into the movements some years past of a Dr. Basil Merryweather, and I returned with information that Holmes received with evident satisfaction, though without surprise. He spent the better part of 11 years in New South Wales, Holmes, before returning to England to establish his present practice. The agent's records show him departing Sydney some 4 years back, aboard a vessel bound for Southampton. 11 years, Watson, in precisely that colony where our shadowy Adrian Vale is said to have gone to ruin and disappeared from family memory. I think we begin to see the shape of our architect's education. Holmes drew from his pocket a slip of paper covered in his own close writing. I have spent a further hour this afternoon among the records of the Royal College, and among certain private inquiries better not detailed here, and I have learned that Dr. Merryweather, during his years in the colony, attended for some months a patient registered under the name of Adrian Vale, a man of advanced years in failing health, and possessed, by the doctor's own contemporary notes, of a most remarkable store of anecdote concerning an English family he claimed as his own, though no relation to that family could ever be satisfactorily proven, and the man himself, I'm given to understand, died without issue, and very possibly without any legitimate claim whatever to the name he bore. Then the true Adrian Vale, if he ever existed under that name in New South Wales, is long dead. Dead, or never truly connected to our family at all, a colonial adventurer who had gathered over years of idle conversation in some outback settlement a quantity of family gossip sufficient to entertain his fellow exiles, and sufficient also, as it now appears, to furnish a physician of ambitious and calculating temperament with all the raw material he required for an impersonation 20 years in the contemplating. I confess the full design was still not entirely clear to me, and I said as much. Consider it thus, Watson. Sir Edmund Vale is known, however faintly, to have had a half-brother sent abroad in disgrace, a fact preserved only in a single old letter and the fading memory of elderly servants. Such a man, were he to reappear after 20 or 30 years, aged, weathered, his manner altered by long exile, could be neither readily confirmed nor readily denied. For who among the living could swear with confidence to the features of a boy last seen decades before? Our doctor, I believe, conceived the design of manufacturing just such a return. But before any impostor could safely present himself and claim a share of the estate, Some confusion must first be sown among the existing wills, some legal fog thick enough that a new and startling claim might slip through unchallenged amid the general uncertainty, or at the least be received with less immediate suspicion than it must otherwise provoke. The duplicate filing was never about Lanchester's fortune at all then, but a smokescreen. Precisely, Watson. Redirect a portion of the estate to a discharged secretary, provide Lestrade with a motive so convenient he could scarcely resist it, and in the confusion and scandal that follows, quietly introduce at some later hour the far more startling figure of a returned half-brother, his claim strengthened rather than weakened by the general disorder already prevailing among the family's legal affairs. A courtroom already occupied with one forgery grows less vigilant, not more, against the appearance of a second and larger deception. It was as we sat over this reconstruction, late into the evening, that Holmes fell suddenly silent, his brow furrowed in the particular manner that told me some fresh recollection had presented itself. "Watson, do you recall, at our very first interview with Dr. Merriweather in this house, any peculiarity of his speech toward the close of a long conversation?" I cast my mind back with some effort. I recall nothing beyond his usual fluency. I confess I nearly missed it myself, and only this evening, turning the matter over, does its significance strike me fully. There was a moment, Watson, late in our questioning, when the doctor, evidently fatigued by the length of our interview, allowed a certain flatness to creep into his vowels, a rhythm quite unlike his customary polished London speech, and closer, I now think, to the very colonial cadence that one witness at the registry professed to hear in our mysterious clerk. A man may govern his accent very successfully while fresh and alert, Watson, but fatigue loosens such disciplines as surely as it loosens the tongue itself. I believe we have been listening these several days to a man conducting two performances at once, the composed London physician, and beneath it, worn thin by long exertion, the accent of 11 colonial years he has laboured very hard and very nearly successfully to conceal. Chapter 9. The Constructed Heir. Holmes sent word that evening to Mr. Arkwright, to Inspector Lestrade, and to the household at Vale House, requesting that all should assemble upon the following afternoon in the very drawing-room where our inquiry had first begun, and I confess that as our cab drew up before that familiar door, I felt something of the old, keen anticipation that had accompanied so many similar gatherings in the course of our long association, tempered now by a genuine sorrow for the household we were about to disturb a final time. We found them assembled as requested, Clara Vale pale and composed in a chair near the fire, Reverend Keene beside her with an air of pastoral solicitude. Mrs. Pritchard permitted at Holmes's particular request to stand near the door, and Dr. Merriweather himself seated a little apart, his broad face arranged in an expression of grave and patient interest, as though he attended merely as a concerned family friend rather than as the object of the inquiry about to unfold. Lestrade stood near the window, his notebook already in hand, and Hugh Lanchester, released that very morning upon Holmes's private representations to the Yard, occupied a chair near Miss Vale, his manner still subdued by the ordeal of his brief imprisonment. "I will not detain you longer than necessary," Holmes began, standing before the cold hearth with his hands clasped loosely behind him. "I wish first to clear from all suspicion Mr. Hugh Lanchester, against whom a quantity of evidence was discovered some days ago in circumstances that seemed, upon their face, entirely damning." "The signatures, the beard," said Lestrade. "You'll want a deal of persuading, Mr. Holmes, before I abandon evidence found in a man's own writing desk. I ask you only to consider, Lestrade, that the practice signatures found in that drawer imitate Sir Edmund's hand as it stood some 15 or 20 years past, while the actual forged affidavit imitates his hand as it stood in the final months of his illness, trembling in precisely those places an aged and failing signature would tremble. No forger sensible enough to study his subject's final tremor with such care would then practise, for concealment's sake, upon so outdated a model." The evidence against Mr. Lanchester was not forged by the same hand that forged our affidavit. It was planted by someone who had studied old family letters, but had never closely examined the document whose guilt he wished to transfer to another man's account. Then who did examine it so closely? Demanded Lestrade, though I fancied his tone had already lost something of its earlier certainty. A man who forged it himself, said Holmes quietly, and who required a visible scapegoat, conveniently near at hand, upon whom suspicion might settle the moment his own larger design drew near completion. The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute, broken only by the settling of coals in the grate. I saw Clara Vale's hand steal toward Lanchester's own, and saw, too, that Dr. Merryweather's composed features had not altered by so much as a flicker. You will recall, Holmes continued, that this affair began with 2 probate filings, apparently genuine, supporting 2 different wills. I put it to you now that the true purpose of that duplicate filing was never Mr. Lanchester's enrichment, but rather the creation of sufficient legal confusion to admit, at some later and carefully chosen hour, a claim far more startling than any dispute between a niece and a discharged secretary. I refer to the reappearance, after some 30 years, of Sir Edmund's half-brother Adrian Vale, believed by this household to be dead in New South Wales. "Adrian Vale is dead," said Merryweather, speaking for the first time, his voice as level and assured as ever I had heard it. "I attended a man of that name myself in the colony some years since. I can testify to his death with a physician's certainty." "You attended a man who bore that name," said Holmes, "though whether he possessed any true right to it neither you nor I can now determine, and whether he is in fact dead, or whether that death has been most conveniently arranged to suit a fresh performance, I confess I cannot yet say with certainty. What I can say, Dr. Merryweather, is that you spent 11 years in that colony, that you attended this claimant personally, and at length, gathering no doubt a rich store of family anecdote from his dying reminiscence, and that you returned to England possessed of precisely the knowledge required to construct, when the moment served, a plausible and moving return of the prodigal. This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes, and very wild conjecture at that. It is conjecture supported, I think, by rather more than you would wish. You purchased, some 6 weeks past, from a theatrical costumer in Drury Lane, material suitable for simulating the weathered complexion and grey whiskers of an elderly man newly returned from a hot climate. You alone of this household possess the medical vocabulary that betrayed itself in your own forged affidavit, in that small but telling phrase, a lucid interval, a term no ordinary forger, unschooled in medicine, would think to include in a document purporting to record a dying man's testamentary clarity. You alone, by Mrs. Pritchard's own recollection, broke your habitual practice of removing your gloves in the sick-room, upon the single occasion when you required your hands concealed while examining papers at Sir Edmund's private desk, gloves, I would observe, of the same fine quality remembered by a porter at the Probate Registry, as worn by our mysterious clerk upon a mild autumn day. And you, Dr. Merryweather, when weariness loosens the careful discipline of your London speech, betray beneath it the very colonial cadence that a second witness professed to hear in that same clerk, a cadence acquired, I do not doubt, across 11 years in New South Wales, and never entirely unlearned. Mrs. Pritchard by the door had gone quite pale, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Reverend Keene stared at the doctor with an expression in which horror and a kind of bewildered grief were very strangely mingled. "You accuse me then," said Merryweather, and I heard now, unmistakably, the faint flattening of his vowels that Holmes had described, brought forth, I thought, by the very strain of the moment against which he had so long guarded himself, of forging my patient's own signature, and of parading myself about London in false whiskers, upon evidence no stronger than a glove and a phrase of medicine. "I accuse you," said Holmes, and his voice, though still quiet, had taken on an edge I had heard him use only rarely, and always in the presence of a guilt he found peculiarly repugnant, of constructing, with considerable patience and no inconsiderable skill, an entire false identity from the bones of a dead or dying stranger's reminiscence, of forging a legal document over the very body of a man you had sworn an oath to heal, and of preparing, behind a screen of confusion and a convenient scapegoat, to introduce that false identity into this family's fortune under cover of grief too raw and too respectable to be closely questioned. I do not say Sir Edmund was without fault in his dealings, Dr. Merryweather. I understand he wronged more than one person in this room, in ways the law can never fully redress, but resentment, however justly earned, does not license calculated fraud, nor impersonation, nor the deliberate ruin of an innocent man's reputation to shield your own design. Your mask, sir, has not fallen through any confession of your own. It has fallen piece by piece through the plain and unforgiving logic of the facts themselves. Dr. Merryweather said nothing further. He sat very still in his chair, his composed features at last, and only at last beginning to show the strain beneath them, while Lestrade, closing his notebook with a snap that seemed to echo through the stricken room, stepped forward to do what the law required of him. Chapter 10. The Reputation of Truth. Dr. Merryweather was taken from Vale House that same afternoon with a quietness that I found, in its way, more affecting than any struggle could have been, for he offered no protest, no further denial, but walked between the constables with the same composed bearing he had worn throughout our acquaintance, as though even in disgrace he could not wholly set aside the professional dignity that had served him so long and so well as a mask. Whether the man he had once attended in New South Wales truly bore the name Adrian Vale by right, or had simply carried it as a convenient fiction gathered from years of colonial gossip, was a question the courts would spend some weeks in untangling, though for the purposes of Sir Edmund's estate the answer, Mr. Arkwright assured us, mattered little, since no legitimate claim of that name could now be advanced by any hand but a proven and honest one. The false probate filing was formally withdrawn within the fortnight, and the estate settled, as it should always have been settled, according to the earlier and undisputed will. Clara Vale came into her inheritance at last, though I thought, when we called upon her some days after the household's ordeal had ended, that she received the news with less triumph than relief, as though the money itself had grown, in the course of these events, a good deal less important to her than the restoration of a good man's name. "I very nearly let my own fear condemn him, Mr. Holmes," said she, seated once more in that same small morning-room hung with her watercolours, Hugh Lanchester standing quietly near the window, his own composure now considerably restored. "I was so afraid of what the world would say of an old attachment, half forgotten and never proper, that I very nearly held my tongue while Hugh stood in danger of the gallows for a crime that was never his. I do not think I shall soon forgive myself for that silence, however innocent its motive." "You were not the architect of his danger, Miss Vale," said Holmes, "and I think you may allow yourself some mercy on that account, whatever severity you choose to visit upon your own conduct in smaller matters. It is a hard lesson, and one this whole household has learned together, that respectability guarded too jealously will sometimes purchase its own safety at another's peril." It was a lesson, indeed, that seemed to weigh most heavily upon the Reverend Keene, whom we encountered as we took our leave, standing alone in the hall with an expression of such genuine and searching unhappiness that I could not but pity him, whatever small part he had played, unknowing, in the affair. "I have spent these several days, Dr. Watson, examining my own conduct with a rigour I fear I too seldom apply to it," said he, as I paused beside him. "I repeated in all innocence rumours that Dr. Merryweather had himself planted, or allowed to flourish, concerning Mr. Lanchester's character, and I did so, I now perceive, chiefly because they came to me clothed in the sort of household gossip that a clergyman, of all men, ought to have examined more sceptically rather than less. I fear I mistook my own respectability, and his, for a species of evidence, when it was nothing more than costume, as Mr. Holmes would say, I shall be a more cautious shepherd of my flock's good name hereafter, I trust, for having learned how easily a respectable voice may serve a falsehood, without ever intending it. Mr. Arkwright, when we called upon him a final time at his chambers in Lincoln's Inn, greeted us with a mixture of gratitude and lingering unease that I found entirely understandable in a man whose whole profession rested upon the presumption that a properly executed document could be trusted at its face. I confess, Mr. Holmes, this affair has shaken my faith in my own calling more than I care to admit. I have built a long career upon the principle that a signature, properly witnessed and properly filed, represents the settled truth of a man's intentions. I begin to wonder how many other such truths, in how many other offices, rest upon foundations no more solid than the one we so nearly accepted here. I would not have your faith shaken so far as to become useless to you, Mr. Arkwright, said Holmes. The law requires its paperwork, and paperwork, properly scrutinized, serves justice very well indeed. I ask only that you remember, in future, that a document is the record of an intention, not a substitute for the observation of the hand and mind that produced it. Where the two can be compared, as we compared the tremor of a genuine hand against the studied hesitation of a copied one, the paper itself will very often confess what its author intended to conceal. We walked homeward that evening through streets already softening toward an early winter dusk, and I found myself turning over, as I so often did at the close of one of Holmes's investigations, the whole curious architecture of deception that had occupied us these past weeks. A household of entirely respectable persons, each trusted absolutely on the strength of calling and costume, concealing among them a design patient enough to have waited 20 years for its execution. It is a melancholy business, Holmes, I said at length, however satisfying its conclusion. A physician sworn to heal turned forger and impostor. A clergyman deceived into repeating slander he believed to be charity. A solicitor's whole faith in his own profession badly shaken. And at the centre of it all, an old man's private cruelties, dead these many weeks, still working their poison through the lives of those he wronged. It is melancholy, Watson, and I will not pretend otherwise, for I have long since ceased to find any pure satisfaction in unmasking guilt, however cleverly constructed. But consider what has been preserved, alongside what has been lost. An innocent man walks free tonight who might otherwise have hanged upon evidence assembled with real cunning and no real justice behind it. A young woman keeps the fortune that was honestly hers, and something better besides, the restored good opinion of the man she once loved, and very nearly betrayed through fear rather than falsehood. And a certain physician, who mistook 11 years of colonial patience for a license to reshape the truth to his own convenience, will answer at last to a court that troubles itself, as I do, with the small and stubborn facts that no performance, however carefully rehearsed, can fully command. We had come by now to our own door in Baker Street, and Holmes paused a moment upon the step, looking back down the lamplit thoroughfare with an expression I had come, over the years, to recognise as something very near contentment. You will remember, I think, Watson, when you come to set this affair down among your records, that in society a fine coat, a steady voice, and a professional title may pass very readily for truth among those who have not troubled to look closer. But to the eye that has learned to look, identity lies elsewhere altogether, in habit, in contradiction, in the small physical facts that no impostor, however patient, however skilled, can ever fully command. It is there, and nowhere else, that a man's true history is written, whatever name he chooses to give himself before the world.